The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the courthouse, but the light did little to ease the heaviness in Elena's chest. She stood at the defendant's table, hands clasped tightly, the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. For years, she had fought to survive, raising her children with nothing but grit and hope. Yet here she was accused of fraud, painted as a criminal. Her heart ached not because of the accusations, but because of the humiliation. She had always lived with pride, never begging, never cheating, never deceiving anyone. Still, the prosecutor's words were sharp, each one twisting the knife deeper as he described her as a manipulator who schemed to take money that did not belong to her. The people seated in the gallery listened intently, some shaking their heads, others whispering among themselves, and Elena could feel every judgmental eye burning into her. The courtroom was large, its walls lined with shelves of law books, its wooden benches filled with strangers who came to watch. Some were neighbors who believed the rumors. Others were curious citizens who enjoyed gossip, and a few were there because they had nothing better to do. Elena stood alone without a proper lawyer. Only a court-appointed defender who sat silently, showing little interest in the case. The prosecutor, however, spoke with authority and passion, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as he moved. Before the jury, he painted pictures of greed and deception, insisting Elena had masterminded schemes to trick people, using false contracts and fake promises. Elena wanted to shout that it wasn't true, that she was the victim of dishonest business partners who had turned everything against her. But her voice felt locked inside her throat. Her eyes wandered up toward the bench where the judge sat. He was a tall man with a face carved from stone, his expression stern and unreadable. His robe hung neatly over his shoulders, and he looked down on the courtroom with an authority that silenced even the boldest voices. Elena's heart tightened as she studied him. There was something in his eyes that struck a painful chord in her memory, a familiarity she could not push away. She had seen eyes like those before, many years ago, when she was younger, before life had worn her down. She quickly looked away, forcing herself to focus, but her hands trembled. She reminded herself that she had no room for weakness. She had to endure, even if the world crumbled around her. The prosecutor's voice grew louder as he leaned toward the jury, his finger stabbing the air. "This woman is dangerous," he declared. "She hides behind her innocent face, but she has cheated hardworking families and destroyed trust in this community. She must face the consequences." His words echoed in the silent room. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Dangerous. If only they knew the nights she went to bed hungry so her children could eat. If only they knew how many jobs she had worked, how many times she walked home in the rain because she couldn't afford bus fare. But none of that mattered here. The truth seemed powerless in the face of lies spoken with confidence. As the prosecutor finally took his seat, the judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The atmosphere grew tense, the entire room waiting for his words. Elena gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. She felt cornered, trapped, as though the walls of the courtroom were closing in on her. For a fleeting moment, her thoughts drifted to her children. She pictured their faces, her triplets, her greatest source of strength. She had promised herself that no matter how much she suffered, they would never be broken, they would never feel abandoned. She had raised them with love, taught them to stand tall. But now, facing the possibility of prison, she wondered if she had failed them after all. The silence was broken only by the scratch of the judge's pen as he made notes. Elena's chest tightened with fear, but she lifted her chin slightly, refusing to collapse in front of them all. She had survived too much to let despair swallow her here. What she did not know was that beyond those courtroom doors, fate was already stirring, and the very children she worried about were on their way, ready to shatter the silence, ready to change everything. The courtroom clock ticked slowly, each second echoing like a drumbeat in Elena's ears. The judge was preparing to speak, his hand already reaching for the gavel. Her heart pounded harder with every passing moment. She knew once the gavel struck, her fate would be sealed. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, confident and smug, certain he had secured victory. Elena's chest tightened with despair. She could almost feel the cold grip of chains around her wrists. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, silently, praying for strength not for herself, but for her children. She prayed they would remain safe, that they would live with dignity, even if she could not stand by their side. But then, before the judge could speak, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom burst open with a loud bang that startled everyone. Inside, heads turned sharply as three young adults strode down the aisle, their presence commanding attention. Elena's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. It was them, her triplets. Daniel, tall and strong with a steady gaze. David, sharp and fierce, his energy radiating like fire. And Diana, graceful yet unyielding, her posture straight as an arrow. They were no longer children. They stood tall, grown and powerful, their faces carrying the strength of the mother who had raised them. Gasps and whispers rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his face twisted in irritation. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, his voice echoing off the walls. But before anyone else could speak, Daniel stepped forward, his voice calm yet firm. "We are her children," he said, his words filling the room. "And we will not let our mother stand here alone." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Elena's eyes filled with tears, her body trembling as she tried to call out to them, to tell them, to sit down, to stay away from this cruel battlefield. But no words left her lips. Deep inside, a spark of pride ignited. They had come not in fear, but in defiance. Diana held a thick folder tightly against her chest. She moved forward and placed it carefully on the defendant's table, the sound of it hitting the wood echoing like thunder. "Inside this folder," she declared, "is proof of our mother's innocence. Receipts, contracts, letters, everything that shows she was framed by people who used her name for their lies." She looked directly at the jury, her eyes unflinching. "We will not let her take the blame for crimes she did not commit." David's fists clenched as he stepped closer, his voice carrying the rawness of years of pain. "Do you want to know who my mother is? She is the woman who worked 2 jobs so that we could eat. She is the woman who never slept, who walked home at midnight in the rain because she couldn't afford a ride. She is the woman who raised 3 children without any help, who gave us everything while she had nothing. And now, you dare to call her a liar, a thief." His words sliced through the air like blades, leaving silence in their wake. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usually steady composure wavering. His eyes lingered on the triplets, one by one. There was something in the curve of Daniel's jaw, the fire in David's eyes, the quiet strength in Diana's face. His heart gave an uneasy thump. They looked familiar to familiar. A thought he had buried long ago tried to surface, but he pushed it down, tightening his grip on the edge of his bench. The prosecutor scoffed, trying to regain control. "This is highly irregular. These young people have no authority here." But before he could continue, Daniel shot him a piercing look and replied, "We have the only authority that matters, the truth." The gallery erupted in murmurs, the air charged with energy. Elena's tears streamed freely now. Her children had not only come, they had come prepared, united, fearless. For years, she had carried the burden alone. But now, standing before the court, she realized she was no longer fighting by herself. Her triplets had stepped into the storm with her, ready to battle for her honor. And though the trial was far from over, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted. The prosecutor's certainty had cracked. The jury's eyes now flickered with doubt, and the judge could not look away from the faces of the 3 who stood tall and unshaken, carrying the very blood he had once tried to forget. The air inside the courtroom grew heavy as the triplets stood before everyone, their presence unshaken despite the storm around them. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "You may proceed," he said, his tone betraying a faint tremor he quickly tried to hide. All eyes shifted to Diana as she opened the folder, her hand steady, her expression focused. From it she pulled out carefully arranged papers, receipts, contracts, and letters, each one proof that their mother had been used as a pawn in a cruel scheme. She laid them on the table with quiet determination, then lifted her chin toward the jury. "Our mother's signature was forged on these documents," she explained. "These are the records that show the real culprits used her name for their business while leaving her to take the fall. She trusted them, and in return they betrayed her." The jury leaned closer, some of them whispering to one another as the papers were passed down the line. For the first time, the certainty that had filled the prosecutor's words began to falter in the eyes of those listening. Elena sat frozen in her chair, her tears flowing silently as she watched her children fight for her, their voices stronger than any defense she could have offered herself. Daniel stepped forward next, his broad shoulders squared, his voice deep and steady. "My mother has lived her entire life with dignity," he said firmly. "She raised the 3 of us without help from anyone. She never begged, never stole, never even once thought of giving up. We saw her struggle, we saw her sacrifice, and we saw her honesty. If she were guilty of these lies, we would not be standing here. But we are here because we know the truth. She is innocent. His words hung in the air, unshakable, leaving the room in a hushed dot. Then David, who had stood back, with fire in his eyes, stepped forward, his voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with every word. "We grew up without a father," he said, his fists clenching at his sides. "She told us he left before we were born. She never once filled our hearts with hatred, even though he abandoned her when she needed him most. She carried that pain, alone, and yet she gave us nothing but love. She deserves honor, not chains." His voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment his anger gave way to the raw wound he had carried his whole life. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their expressions softening. The judge leaned back in his chair, but his chest tightened with every word. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside his heart was pounding like a drum. Each of the triplets' faces burned into his mind, the same jawline he saw in the mirror every morning, the same intensity he once carried as a young man. His throat went dry. Could it be possible? Could the very children standing before him be his own? The thought clawed at him, demanding attention, but he forced it down. This was a courtroom. He had to stay composed. The prosecutor, desperate to regain control, stood abruptly. "This is nothing more than a performance," he snapped, his voice laced with frustration. "Emotional stories do not erase the facts. The evidence against this woman is clear." But before he could continue, Diana lifted another paper high, her eyes blazing. "These are bank statements," she said sharply. "Money that was supposedly taken by our mother ended up in the accounts of her business partners. Every trail leads back to them, not to her. If you still call that evidence against her, then you are blind." A stunned silence followed. The jury stared at the prosecutor, waiting for his response, but his lips pressed into a thin line. He had no immediate answer. Elena covered her mouth with trembling hands. Her children had done what she could not. They had turned the tide. For the first time since the trial began, a spark of hope lit inside her. She had carried the burden of truth alone for so long. But now it was being spoken out loud for the world to hear. And as the judge looked into the eyes of the triplets, his composure cracked further. He could no longer deny the truth that was gnawing at him. These were not just Elena's children, they were his. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint shuffling of papers. The weight of the triplets' words still lingered in the air, pressing down on everyone present. The jury members looked unsettled. The gallery whispered quietly among themselves, and the prosecutor sat stiffly in his chair, his confidence shaken. But the man who felt the greatest turmoil of all was the one who should have been the calmest, the judge. He sat high above them all, but inside he was unraveling piece by piece. His hand gripped the gavel tightly, his knuckles white, as his gaze flicked again to the three young people who stood proudly before the court. For years, he had buried the memory of Elena, pushing it so deep he thought it would never resurface. She had once been the center of his world, a woman of warmth, laughter, and quiet strength. But when responsibility loomed and fear whispered in his ear, he had made the choice that would haunt him forever. He walked away. He convinced himself it was the right decision, that Elena would find someone else, that she would build a better life without him. And yet, as he stared at the faces of the triplets, his chest burned with the truth he had always known but never admitted. He had not left Elena alone. He had abandoned a family. His composure cracked when David's words echoed in his mind. "We grew up without a father." He swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat refused to ease. He had spent his life in law, building a reputation of fairness, demanding truth and justice from all who stood before him. But here he was, guilty of the deepest injustice of all. His own children had suffered because of his cowardice. He could no longer pretend. He leaned forward, his voice quieter than before, but trembling with weight. "What did you say your mother's name is?" The question seemed simple, but his tone made the entire courtroom pause. Diana turned to face him, her eyes sharp yet confused by his sudden interest. "Her name is Elena," she said, her voice steady. The name hit him like a hammer. His breath caught, and his chest tightened painfully. He removed his glasses, placing them on the desk with a trembling hand. For a long moment, he simply stared at Elena. She refused to meet his gaze, her eyes cast downward, but he could see the tears clinging to her lashes. His heart twisted. She knew. She had known from the moment she saw him on the bench. The triplets looked between the judge and their mother, sensing something unspoken in the air. Daniel narrowed his eyes, suspicion creeping into his expression. "Why do you ask?" he said, carefully, his voice edged with tension. The judge exhaled slowly, his hands shaking as he gripped the bench, because his voice cracked, and for the first time in his career, He allowed emotion to seep into his words. Because I knew her. Long ago. His eyes darted back to the triplets, scanning their faces again, and this time he no longer tried to deny it. They were his reflection pieces of him staring back with anger, pain, and confusion. His next words shattered the silence. I am your father. The gallery erupted in gasps and shocked cries. The prosecutor's jaw dropped. The jury froze in disbelief, and Alina covered her face as sobs broke free. The triplets stood stiff as statues, their eyes wide with shock. Daniel stepped forward, his voice shaking with rage. You, he spat. You're our father. His fists clenched, the betrayal boiling to the surface. David's voice thundered, filled with raw hurt. You left her. You left us. The judge bowed his head, shame washing over him in heavy waves. I was a coward, he admitted, his voice trembling. I thought leaving was easier than facing my responsibilities. I told myself lies to make it feel justified. But not a day has passed that I haven't regretted it. His voice broke, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I will not fail you now. The courtroom was no longer just a place of lit, had become a stage of truth, of broken pasts colliding with the present. Alina wept openly, the years of silence and sacrifice finally breaking into pieces. The triplets stood torn between fury and disbelief, their hearts pounding with the shock of a truth they had never imagined. And the judge, once a man of stone, now stood exposed before them all, not as a figure of authority, but as a father who had abandoned his children, begging silently for a chance at redemption. The courtroom was frozen in shock, the echoes of the judge's confession still hanging in the air like thunder after a storm. Alina wept quietly at the defendant's table, her hands covering her face, years of buried emotions rushing to the surface. The triplets stood before everyone, their hearts racing, their minds torn between anger and disbelief. They had come to defend their mother, to fight against injustice, but they had never expected the man who presided over her trial to reveal himself as the father, who had walked away before they were even born. Daniel's voice was the first to shatter the silence, his words sharp with fury. You left her. You left us. Do you know what that did to her? Do you know what it did to us? His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his fists shaking at his sides. David's voice followed, raw and full of pain. We grew up watching her suffer, working herself to the bone just to keep food on the table. We never had a father to guide us, to protect us. All we had was her. And now you stand there and expect us to believe that you regret it. His words cracked, his anger breaking under the weight of years of silent hurt. The judge bowed his head, shame carved deep into his face. His voice trembled as he answered. I expect nothing. Not forgiveness, not understanding. I only offer the truth. I should have spoken years ago. I was weak, and I have lived with the shadow of that weakness every day. But I will not allow my cowardice to condemn your mother now. I may have failed you as a father, but I will not fail her as a judge. He lifted his gavel with hands that shook, but with a voice that carried firm authority. After reviewing the evidence presented and the testimony given, it is clear that Alina was not the orchestrator of these crimes. She was betrayed, not guilty. Therefore, he struck the gavel down, the sound echoing like a promise fulfilled. The case is dismissed. Alina is free. The gallery erupted into a mixture of gasps, cheers, and murmurs. Some clapped, others simply sat in awe of the storm that had unfolded before their eyes. Alina broke down into tears, her face buried in her hands, the years of fear and humiliation finally dissolving into relief. The triplets rushed to her side, their arms wrapping around her tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe freely. The judge stood slowly, removing his robe, as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. He descended from the bench, each step heavy with the burden of his past. He stopped before Alina and the triplets, his eyes wet with tears. I cannot undo the years I abandoned you, he whispered, his voice breaking. I cannot erase the pain I caused. But if there is any place for me in your lives, even as a shadow, I will spend the rest of my days trying to earn it. The triplets exchanged glances, their emotions a whirlwinding jar, hurt, confusion, but also something else. Something softer that lingered beneath the pain. Diana, with her calm strength, spoke for them all. We don't know if we can forgive you, not yet, but we will not carry the same bitterness that destroyed you once. For now, our place is with her. She turned to her mother, who clung to her children, with all the love she had left to give. The judge nodded, tears streaming down his face. He understood. Forgiveness could not be demanded, had to be earned, step by step, with patience and humility, and he was ready to spend the rest of his life trying. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Elena and her children walked out together, the sunlight streaming through the high windows catching on their faces. They were free not only from the false charges, but from the silence that had haunted their past. Their story was no longer one of abandonment and suffering, but of truth revealed, dignity defended, and the strength of love that could not be broken. For the first time in decades, the judge did not feel like a man of law, but simply a father standing at the edge of a second chance, praying that one day his children would let him step closer. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one truth was clear: the family that had been divided by fear and lies now stood with the possibility of healing, born from the courage of 3 children who refused to let their mother fall. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Subscribe to the Silent Side USA for more powerful stories that will keep you hooked till the end.